So, you can move forward. You're invited to move forward. There's like 3 full rows up here that has nobody in them. 4 rows. See, nobody ever actually moves. You know, there's that joke about having the front pew that rotates to the back. Somebody actually needs to do that. How am I in front? I don't know. All right, so what we're going to start is, we're just going to have folks introduce themselves very briefly. My hope is that this is a time of some interaction. So like I said, I'll do an introduction, and I said introduce kind of who you are, where you're from, your context for ministry, any personal things you want to share, and then define sacred space. Because part of it is we're all going to have different understandings, and so we'll just go down the line with that, and then I'll ask another question, and then just to make it spicy, I'll slip in a totally random question every once in a while, just to kind of keep you on your toes. And then we'll open it up for questions out here, so we're not waiting until the very end to do question and response time. So we'll do that a couple times throughout. So be prepared to ask a question, and we'll run a mic to you and make that all work. So let's start with Larissa. And I'll say one thing about Larissa is the celebrity in the house. So and she would not say that herself. But for those of you that are Presbyterian Church USA, Larissa is your current vice moderator of the General Assembly of the PCUSA. So really, seriously, stand for the office.
I also wouldn't have had you do that.
Standing for the office is one of those really strange, wonderful things that we do in our denomination, because it's not about the person, right? It's not about the individual, but it's about the office that holds the story of the church for a few years. And so I could never get my congregation to stand for me, though. I would walk back in, and they're like, we'll give you another gesture, but it won't be standing. All right, so introduce yourself and then define a little bit about sacred space. What does that mean for you?
So my name is Larissa Kwong Abazia. I am also, in addition to serving as vice moderator for the next 2 years, a pastor in Queens, New York, which is the most diverse county in the country. And my congregation in Forest Hills is a reflection of that. So we're a multicultural, multi-ethnic congregation. I was just talking to Andy about this. There's no racial ethnic majority in my congregation, which means like we're multicultural beyond like 80% white. And so I would say like the most of one ethnic group I have is maybe folks from Guyana or Madagascar, but I actually am not really sure. Like that statistical report we have to fill out in my congregation every year is a headache. Like we've just given up. We've categorized 16 people as other because we have people from the Caribbean that like don't want to be in any of those categories. A lot of people that don't want to be in those categories. So anyway, so that's my church context. Right now, we have about 65 to 75 folks in worship on a Sunday. We worship in English. And so for me, sacred space, in addition to the things that Bruce has said, is to me, sacred space is providing safe space for people to be who they are. So it's providing that kind of space so people can come and bring all that they are and also be vulnerable to be made uncomfortable sometimes in worship. And to just have their lives disrupted by the Spirit, by God, and then somehow being sent out into the world, nourished in some way for that work.
My name is Warren Cooper. I grew up in the Berean Presbyterian Church here in Philadelphia Presbytery, and chained to the pew as a child. My father was the pastor there. I currently am a member here at Old Pine and serve a Presbyterian church called Cedar Park Presbyterian Church, which I call that church the multicultural church with no white people, because they're from every country in the Caribbean, a few countries in Africa, and it's really an interesting thing to watch when we speak from a multicultural perspective. There are certain expectations that we have, or certain postures that we take, and to me that particular church is incredibly intriguing, just in terms of the manner in worship and the relational aspects. So I, of course, then grew up Presbyterian, And we did a lot of afternoon services, so I knew about the AMEs and the Baptists and learned how to stay in church for way longer than anyone would want to stay in church. But the function for me of sacred space, it's interesting because sacred space for me can be anywhere. Sacred space emerges for me as a place where God introduces God's self to us. My favorite story about sacred space is Jacob's ladder, where Jacob was in the middle of making a break for it, fell asleep on a rock, and saw God. That's an abridged version of the story. But the notion that he expresses at the end, wow, God was here, and I didn't even know. Right? So sacred space is every space for me that we acknowledge, where we acknowledge reaching for God. And in a church context, I would agree with all of the things that are said, and add simply that our own identities have to be mixed up in all of the things that we aspire to be. So we can't really be trying to be something that we're not, or just artificially creating something because we think people will come. Sacred space emerges as we authentically reach for Christian community.
My name is Andy Greenhow. I'm the Minister of Stewardship, Congregational Partnership, and Belonging. That is the longest title in Christendom, I'm sure of it, at a church 10 blocks from here called Broad Street Ministry. The congregation there is a lot of millennial types. We have some people who come in from the suburbs who worship in the morning at a church that supports Broad Street, and then they want to sort of get the same text again a second time in a slightly different way at Broad Street Ministry in the evening. We also have a hospitality ministry where we serve about 60,000 meals a year to vulnerable Philadelphians, and so I function in some ways as a chaplain to that congregation that comes throughout the week to receive a meal and some community. And when I think about the definition of sacred space, there's a great line in our Constitution, the Book of Order, that says that worship is where we say, or where it is made clear in this time and in this place what is true in every time and in every place. So I want to take what Warren said about sacred space could be anywhere and say that for me it's anywhere where we see the story of salvation sort of laid bare for us all to see. That there are some times when you're in a church service where it is so clear that we understand the Christian story. And then there are other times in a worship service when it's a little bit harder to see. And for me, the sacred space is the one where we know in this time and in this place what is true in every time and every place.
Hold on to that. You can just kind of go back and forth. Okay, so first, a little product placement. If you are live tweeting or live Instagramming, please use the sacred spaces. That would make the people at PHS very happy as they're trying to kind of move into new ways of communicating. So, and their Twitter and Instagram is Presby History, so you can get on there. Okay, so some of this here, we'll talk about big picture, 30,000 feet, and then kind of land the plane as well. Later on, I'm going to ask you about how to advise people and other things that folks want to know. But what's an example of a sacred space besides your own that you think embodies what it means to be sacred space? Like, can you think of an example you've been to recently that here's I was there and I felt it, knew it, and here are maybe a couple examples why that happened. So go for it.
Sure. I was thinking during Just a Closer Walk with Thee, Warren, the first time I ever heard that song was in a bar in New Orleans called Vaughn's Lounge, when I saw Kermit Ruffins and the Barbecue Swingers at his weekly Thursday show, and I heard that song for the first time in New Orleans, and it's the song about walking with Jesus, and I could see, as I looked around me, the whole story of salvation history happening before me. There was the giving of the law by the door, where there was a guy getting kicked out. We saw him receiving the law, and there was crucifixion and resurrection, because we're here in New Orleans post-Katrina. That there's a haze of smoke, and I see some sanctification in the back, where that guy needs some sanctification. So for me, it was hearing that song in that particular time, in that particular place, was surprisingly sacred. Not surprisingly, it was sacred. It was very sacred.
Well, not to begin a trend, but my example is also from a bar, where I say that you can have church in a bar, you just have to do different words of institution. It was a sacred space because people were there to experience something. And it's interesting to use the Jesus and Jesus, God, Christ language, because there were no liturgies, there were lots of prayers, but they had different ways of expressing. There were people that were dancing in the corner with no one in particular. The celebration of that, there were people who were engaged fully in the music. And I was in a performance position, so I was able to see the music affecting everyone, and in particular portions, it was really a worshipful place. The place transcended from wherever it was to a place where God's Spirit was literally speaking and expressing.
So I have a 3-year-old son, and so when you ask this question, I immediately think of the playground. Because whenever I bring my son to the playground, it's like kids just know how to be together. I think there's a lot that we could learn from that. And so to just watch my son and other kids kind of learn what it's like to enter this playground culture in that moment, because the next day there's like a whole different slew of kids that are there, and there's a different way of being in that space. But somehow they all share that space together and play together, and it kind of draws the parents together too, and folks that are there. So yeah, playgrounds. There's a lot we can learn from there.
Evelyn won't show up though, because she'll just beat up kids. Okay, so I want to open it up some questions, and you can be anything they've talked about, things you wanted to know, anything. So I will play Donahue. That'll probably be the easiest thing. And some of you all know who Donahue was, right? Okay. There was just like ooh. I just really aged myself. All right, does anyone have any questions for them, for anything you want to share comments? Really? Oh, all right, good. And you have to talk really closely into this mic here, so there you go.
I have a question.
You can say who you are and where you're from.
My name is Alice Broom. I'm from the Ocean Heights Presbyterian Church in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. And I have a question for Mr. Cooper, and that is your music or your arrangements available for purchase?
That's a good.
Yes, on the sacred space of my website. Yes, they are, and I'll let you know.
Is it warrencooper.com?
It actually, so you can, it's warrencooper.wordpress.com is where you can find some of those arrangements.
Warren and I are hunter-gatherer workers. Like, we have a lot of different things going on, a lot of different places, so shill your stuff, man, it's awesome. I actually have a really, really old CD of yours that we got when we did the 7% pastors gathering
Christmas.
Christmas gathering, so I have like vintage stuff. It's awesome. All right, other questions about Sacred Center? Right.
Hi, I'm Susan Kirsch from Wayne Presbyterian. We've become very oriented towards technology, and I think the church has really gotten with that. But how do we improve human connections? I find that a lot of people in ministry are like, oh, we're doing all this stuff online. And I'm sensing that people are feeling less and less connected in a human person to person.
Did everybody hear that? So I'll repeat it. So there are a lot of, the technology is obviously all around us. Churches are trying to get in with that, but there's a sense that we're missing the human connection. And so how can we make sure we don't lose that and reconnect with that? And I suppose any of you can go for that.
Unfortunate to be holding the mic. So, interestingly, there are some churches where I either do worship or attend that the passing of the peace can last for 15 minutes, right? So there are a number of pastors that I know of who, have different feelings about that. But of the ones who encourage it and are not watching the clock about how much time it will take. The intentional human contact, the intentional engagement is really very important in nurturing that and continuing to nurture that human connection. Even if you are talking about what time you're going to meet at the mall later, it's still a connection. Also, the whole aspect of community singing and being totally engaged in the whole call responsive piece. There is that as well in my list there, and pass the mic to.
My congregation has this like longing ever since I've gotten there to hear testimony. I don't think people have always used that word, but there is this yearning for sharing story, and I think stories are so powerful. And so we're actually considering taking time in every single worship service, because what better way to use your time than to have people share their stories with one another. Another thing in my congregation, and this totally comes with understanding context, but we'll actually have small group discussion in the middle of worship. And this last time when I did it, I could not bring them back. And the way I actually realized to kill the conversation was to say, well, what do you all want to share about your conversation, which you just talked about? And then it just went quiet. But people really just enjoy, it was like 10 minutes of talking with one another in worship, and what better way to use that time, I felt, than to let people share their stories and their thoughts with one another, as opposed to me always being the talking head from the pulpit. So.
One of the cool things about Broad Street Ministry is that we were a totally closed church, and so there was no one around who was going to say, like, this is the pew that I endowed, so you better not tear it out. So, we could think a little bit creatively about architecture of spaces, and I think one of the things that we run into is that our pews, that our architecture is designed around is designed for one particular thing, and that is that you all there are supposed to be looking at what's going on up here, right? Because this is where the word is proclaimed, and that makes sense given our theology. But I do like the interesting thinking that's happening about the way that we design our spaces and the architecture of the space. But the other thing is, and that's, Jason, I don't want to rip up your pews wherever you are. Or I do, I don't know.
Tell it,
but
we'll
yeah. But the other thing is we have, like, the cool thing about worshiping a God who is incarnate is that there's like the embodiment of our faith in like our, like flesh and blood and bones and all that kind of stuff. I don't actually think that can really happen online. With respect to I don't know if you actually believe this can happen, but I don't think sacred space can happen online. I just don't think
I'm
it can.
just going to make faces at you now.
Yeah. I just don't think it can happen, right? I think it really needs the passing of the peace where you like actually put your hand into another person's hand. And I like the idea of taking communion every week. And I like the idea of doing it by intention, like you're sharing the same loaf as somebody else. And like, is that gross? Sometimes, yeah. But it should be. That's how you have community and connection.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to ask you another question as the panel, and then we'll do another round of Q&A from here, so really start thinking of your question. Your first is a very random question that has nothing to do with this, but I like to find out personally about panelists, so you're not just one thing. So before you answer the real question, you get walk-up music, at a baseball game, and they're going to go up and hit. They play music for that batter. Okay, so what's your walk-up song? Okay, and then here's your real question. So don't spend a lot of time on that first one. Unless it's Debbie Gibson, and then you can explain why. Sorry. What's the biggest mistake you have seen or done yourself when trying to create sacred space? Like when you look back, you're like, oh, what was I thinking? Or you watch somebody and like, I don't know what they were thinking. Just to kind of, what are you trying to avoid? Are there mistakes that you've done or you've seen in trying to create worshipful, creative space? So first your walk-up song, and then the mistakes you sing.
I have a story. But do you have one?
No, I think you should go first.
Right,
I'm still thinking about my song.
I think my song, I've been listening to a lot of Public Enemy lately. I don't know why, but I'm gonna go with Fight the Power.
Are they still together?
No, they're not.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge. But I've been thinking a lot about Public Enemy, so I'm gonna go with Public Enemy's Fight the Power as my walk-up song. And then the Sacred Space Blunder, Blender and Sacred, yeah. So I used to be the director of young adult ministries at a church in the suburbs out there called in Wayne Presbyterian. And I was trying to like teach them different spiritual disciplines, like spiritual practices. And one of them, we were going through a whole bunch, and some of these were I really liked, some of them I didn't. One was guided meditation. So I read a scripture passage from Jeremiah, the call of Jeremiah, and I had a book of guided meditations that they were gonna close their eyes and like get, in touch with the Holy Spirit, and I was gonna read aloud from this guided meditation book. And I lost my place, so I flipped, I've read the passage, they now have their eyes closed, we're in this coffee shop, and I flipped to the one about Jeremiah, and I'm reading, and it's not making any sense, and I discovered that it's a different part of Jeremiah. It's not the call of Jeremiah, this is now Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, and I've been reading that, and I'm like, oh crap. So I flip back to the other Jeremiah one, and just start reading that midway through, and get to the end, amen, I'm like, okay, you can now open your eyes. And they open their eyes and look like, what just happened? And it was one of those things where I should have just like gone with it. But I got nervous, I got anxious, and I tried to mid-course correct, and it didn't work.
So let me just follow up here. So what's the learning from that? Other than just kind of keep going, but what's kind of the learning that you take from that?
Yeah, I'm in a play right now, and the director says, remember, there are no mistakes in theater. So like if you screw up on stage, they don't know you screwed up. You just like keep going, like double down on your mistake and find your way out of it before somebody notices. Like no one will notice. You're the only one who knows. And I think that if I had actually like read it all the way through, and they had gotten one coherent thing, like they got scripture, and then they were going to get something else that would have been coherent inside of itself. But instead, I got anxious, and I should have just like. Sometimes you just gotta just double down on a mistake and see what happens.
We have bar metaphors, now we have gambling metaphors. This is great. Okay.
Double down in the spirit. Well, I'm stuck on my song. And so I will say, Earth, Wind, and Fire's Keep Your Head to the Sky, which is not rowdy at all, but it's a great song and speaks to me. I'm trying to decide which one of these. So we've done, I remember when church, I'll stick with the bar motif because lots of different things happen in the bar. We actually we're trying to do a worship service in a tavern. And it was during the time that it was closed. So we were in the whole, sing a couple of Lutheran hymns in their natural habitat kind of place. And we had beer with church, which I must admit is something as a child I've always wanted to know what that was like. And the mistake was that the space was not fixed so that it would be intimate enough. And we didn't start the service early enough because during kind of the middle to the end, people started to come in, and these were people who, they needed a drink, and they weren't going to not have one. So there was a competition that arose between those who were trying to worship in a new way and those who were like, what are those weird people doing in a circle in the corner in our bar kind of space? The learning is that if you are trying to create a sacred space, that space must also be secured so that it will remain as you would have it for the entirety of the experience.
Unless you're figuring out a way to have that be part of the experience itself, which you clearly were not trying to.
Well, we did that next week. It was actually, when we were doing the statistics, all of those people who came in had attendance.
So I'm just going to say the first song that popped in my head so you can judge me. It's Kelly Clarkson's Walk Away.
I was thinking it was going to, T-Swizzle, Shake It Off, or,
That was the second one.
Taylor Swift, sorry for the...
And having just said that I have folks in my congregation speak to one another, I did when I was in seminary. I did pulpit supply at a church the next town over from the town that I grew up in, and I tried to do the same thing in the middle of my sermon. And so I invited people to like turn to their neighbor and talk to one another, and they all just stared at me. And I just was like, what do I do now? And kind of the same thing. So, and I'm like somewhat comfortable with silence, so I just stood there and stared back at them. And they just stared at me. We did that for a few minutes, and then I just kept on going with my sermon. But I think the learning part for that is to really know your context. Because I have just kind of rounded my first year in my congregation, and I had a friend who gave me similar advice, which was in your first year, try different things, because then you could always say, oh, I didn't know, which is what I've done. Like sometimes I've stepped in some golden calves in my congregation. I've said, oh, I didn't know, but I'm glad you told me that now. But going into a completely different context where I didn't fully take that into account, I think I was kind of asking for it a little bit, So knowing your context, I think is really important.
Thank you. I'll share a quick story around that too. So the congregation I served was a very kind of open space church where we were in a circle, very conversational. Every aspect was conversational and interactive. And so for a long time, they would invite our leadership team, can you come do your worship service at our church? And we tell them, no, because you're not our church. Because it's not like you can just take part A, B, and C and place it over here, and you don't find that in any greater way than conversations. Because most churches are not trained and comfortable with a culture of interacting during worship. I mean, really, other than when you're told to get up and talk to each other, when else in most Presbyterian churches do you just randomly turn and talk to someone? It's like in an elevator, if you face the wrong way, people look at you weird. So if you just started turning around in your pew and started talking, it's an awkward feeling because the architecture, and that's not our culture. So we learned that the hard way, right? We come in and we do the same thing. All right, now we're going to do 10 minutes of conversation. And they're like, 10 minutes? That's a long time, right? And if they're not used to it, they won't. So thank you, good context. All right, questions for the panelists? Really? No questions?
What's your song, Bruce?
Oh, what's my song? Well, right now it probably is Taylor Swift's Shake It Off. I have 3 girls in my family, and none of them like Taylor Swift really that much. So I like her just to mess with them, because like their dad does all sorts. Sure, that's why. That's why. Okay, let's move on. So, any questions for our panelists? Yeah, one more.
Not so much a question, but as a comment, I was thinking of my own life story, and I had been elected as a ruling elder, but I hadn't yet been ordained, but I was really watching how our church was doing communion, because I knew I'd be called upon to do that. And in this church, they had a women's guild who prepared the elements and set them out on the table, but the servers were folks from the session. So church is going through, and the pastors stand up there and they do the words of the institution, and they look out, and there are no elders. None. 0. Sit. There is nobody there. And the pastors look at each other like, okay, what do we do now? And from the congregation, folks who were elders stood up, walked forward, and beautifully took the elements, served the people. It was one of the most moving things I'd ever seen. Then they went to the back of the church in the narthex and loudly started pointing fingers and shouting, "Ooh, totally ruined it." So the idea is, like you had said, once you had it down, you had to trod a new path. Go with it.
Well, and there's something about creating space that has room for the Spirit to move, right? I mean, I think there's something about some of our services, both contemporary and traditional, however you want to describe those, sometimes get so over-programmed that there isn't room for the Spirit to move, or when the Spirit does kind of crash it, our anxiety builds up and we don't know what to do with that and we can't adapt. So I think there's like, how do we leave room for the Spirit to move beyond our own plans? Yes, question back here. Let me run back. There you are.
One of my questions is, I was wondering if there are boundaries that are set for most people in the congregation and reflect the sacred spaces in the congregation, as far as the individual person in the church, edifice, you name it, congregation. Those boundaries in respect of the Spirit, in respect of God, and in respect of Jesus Christ inside of the church, the edifice. I mean, are there boundaries?
So are you asking if we have, for instance, if you have a conversational style worship, how do you, like, are there bounds for what people say or what people do? Or
as far as respecting that sacred space for that person's life in the congregation.
Because it may be different than others.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
okay.
then some people come from different cultural interpretations.
All right, anybody want to take that? How do you, I mean, the kind of sacred space is different for different people, and how do you navigate all of that within a community and keep safe, healthy boundaries and all that?
Carefully. So the congregation that I serve, like I said, right now is multicultural, and they're a hugging congregation. And so when we do the passing of the peace, we don't just shake hands, we hug. And I think, at least in the last decade, if you've gone to seminary, people say, do not hug your congregants, do not hug children. If you hug them, you do like an A-frame hug, you know? I mean, you gotta keep boundaries. And if I did that in my congregation, people, it would kind of be strange, it would be odd. So I think a lot of it is really understanding and honoring where people are. Because there are some things in my congregation where we couldn't do. Because people have really different cultural boundaries and understandings. And so for example, when I do baptisms now, I've learned, my previous congregation, which was a predominantly white congregation in Chicago, we always had baptisms in the beginning of the service because they were worried about the kid getting upset in the service and stuff. If I do that in my church now, I did that once. And the family who had their child who was being baptized came in right after my sermon. So like 40 minutes into the service. And so we just kept on rolling through the service. And people were wondering, like, where's the family? What's happening? And it's because we have people from over 20 different countries that have different understandings of time. And so service starts at 11, but people come in at like 11:40, 11:45 for worship. So we kind of move with the way and where people are at.
I'm going to follow up with you on that. So the hugging thing, right? So how do you, in the midst of a hugging church, somebody who is there and that is, for whatever reason, that's not part of their, it's not a comforting experience for them or not a welcoming. Has that happened, or have you all had to deal with that, or is it just something people don't share? I mean,
yeah, so we've had to deal with a little bit, and it's an odd, like, we have a conversation about it with our greeters, especially because in the greeting line, my greeters will hug people as they're going out. And so we've had conversations with our greeters and just said, not everybody is comfortable with hugging, and it may be surprising, but let's like meet people where they're at. So we do have to talk about it.
So when you were asking your question, I was having two distinct flashbacks. One was the very first time in the church where I grew up where someone suggested that the communion table be moved. It was, and I was young at the time and had a vantage point on that exchange, we'll call it, that I shouldn't have, like I was a fly on the wall almost. And it was an interesting thing to see that conflict. The other thing that came to me was this particular pew being the sacred place where no one else sits except Mrs. Jones, you know, and it's the individual space. And that was funny. It's one of the funniest moments in church, one of the 347 funniest moments in church, was to see a visitor come and sit in this particular woman's pew, who happened to be among the more animated of members. And, well, that morning was an interesting thing. Both of those things are like, speak to know where you are and knowing your context. And even in a context that could be new or familiar, you know, there are lots of people that you see all the time and you don't really know them. So it's an issue of being able to engage your context and be able to have a sense of what those boundaries might be, and to be able to make your interaction and also your worship speak to that.
I understood your question maybe a little differently. I heard you talking about the church building and the edifice itself, and I was thinking about, there's a professor at the Lutheran Seminary here in Philadelphia who wrote a book about all of the worshiping communities on Germantown Avenue. Every single one of them, like 80 some, from all the way out of Chestnut Hill to all the way into Kensington. And she talked about the churches that have been in formerly commercial spaces, like a furniture store that's now a mosque, or like a convenience store that's now a storefront church. That the people who attend worship at those places work very hard to ensure the holiness of that church by doing things like don't bring your food and drink into the sanctuary, because they're trying to sort of claim it as a holy place. And that one of the luxuries of being Presbyterian is that we have these buildings that are imbued with holiness by their history or whatever it is that makes them holy. And I don't know exactly what that is, but in a way it liberates us to do things to them, like have food and drink in them if we want to, like we have these water bottles here, and you know there might be a hoagie out there somewhere. But like we don't need to handle our spaces with kid gloves because they're not reclaimed spaces. So I don't have a word on the boundary question. I went to seminary recently and I was told that the evangelical side hug is the best maneuver. This, like the fronts don't touch thing, right? You just lean into the person. But I thought when you create a holy space, it's different if you're reclaiming a space versus if it's been holy from its inception.
Great, thank you. All right, so here's, we're going to do a last questions and then we'll finish up. There's a wedding that's going to happen here in a few hours, so we need to make sure that we get out of here. Okay, so your not throwaway question, but your kind of fun question is a smell that reminds you of your childhood. Okay. And then your last thing is, if you could give one caution and one encouragement for those who are seeking to continue to create holy space, just as the gay people here are engaging in that conversation, one caution and one encouragement. So, smell from your childhood, caution, and encouragement.
Mom's chocolate chip cookies. And I think the caution is, don't worry too much if you're doing it wrong. Go with it. And then I don't know if this is the exhortation or the caution, but the other thing is, I don't think the opposite of sacred, that the way you can understand sacredness is by looking at what you think is its opposite. So if you think that the opposite of sacred is profane or secular, I don't think I agree with you about what sacred is. I think that the opposite of sacred is shallow.
So the smell from my childhood is the way that the beach smelled during the summer. It was Atlantic City, so it smells different now. But the smell of the ocean is my childhood memory of smell. So an extension of the last thing I said, because a lot of people, try to say, okay, we're going to do this project, and it's a holy project, and we're going to create sacred space. Okay, thoughts from you. You have any ideas, and you do brainstorming, and we use our brains a lot to figure things out. the authenticity that is required for truly sacred space means that you are who you really are in that space, and that space becomes a safe place, not only for that to happen, but for you to be able then to have a worshipful experience. So I would say that the caution is to be in your head too much about what it is that you're going to do. And then the exhortation would be to really break down all of the concepts concerning the box and use that wide view to actually really understand not just who people are, but to be free and receiving of however that happens.
So the smell from my childhood is there, and my parents' house still smells like this. There's a smell from pan-frying Chinese food that I can just, when I walk into my parents' house even now, it still just like smells like home. So my exhortation would be to encourage you to think about worship in a multi-sensory way, that people learn in a lot of different ways. And so some people are auditory learners, but other people are tactile. Other people are bodily, other people it's nature, it's doing, singing, being in so many different ways. And so to really think about worship in that way, what are the ways that you can incorporate all the senses and all the different ways that people learn into worship? Maybe not all in one worship service, but just as you're planning worship. And then my caution would be, and it's an encouraging caution, that we cannot control how the Holy Spirit works. And so you will try things, and I'll give you an example. On Transfiguration Sunday, Glowing Jesus Sunday, as I like to call it.
Is that on the front of your bulletin?
It will be this year.
It will be this year.
In my church in Chicago, I handed out glow sticks to everybody in the congregation with their bulletin. And during my sermon, I asked people to snap their glow stick when they heard the word light. And I thought, okay, everybody's gonna snap their glow stick like the first or second time I say it in my sermon. And it happened throughout the whole service. And it was so jarring to me as I was preaching and as the rest of worship service was going on, because then people started snapping their glow stick even when it wasn't the word light, but just something spoke to them. And I thought, this is how God works. Like, we are all experiencing God in different ways, in different times, and this is what it means to be the body of the church. And so it was something that I wasn't expecting at all and hadn't planned for, but was just exactly what reflected the message that day. So just, who knows where God could lead you.
Great, thank you all very much. We give them a hand for being on the panel. Thank you. And we want to also thank Presbyterian Historical Society for kind of gathering this, and for the folks here at Old Pine for opening their space up and everything. So thank you all very much. And we have an invitation for something next, for something fun.
So it's my pleasure to invite everyone next door to the Presbyterian Historical Society. It's that way. There's a lot of staff members with us with gold tags who will help you get there. There is an exhibit called Sacred Space, Building Communities of Faith, that we invite you to come and take a look at. It's actually what inspired this event, because we wanted to show you that there's a long history of developing sacred space in the Presbyterian Church, and we're still doing it today. I want to thank all the panelists and the Old Pine Sacred Jazz Ensemble and Old Pine Presbyterian Church for having us here, and all my colleagues who helped me to make this event possible. There's wine next door and food, and there's also soft drinks, and it's all free, so please come on over.